I'm not leaving until someone tells the truth.
Elena.
The words were quiet, but they cut through the dining room like a held breath.
Look at me.
At the far end of the private restaurant, under chandeliers that spilled warm gold across polished glass and white linen, Elena Carter stood with a tray pressed close to her apron, her fingers still for the first time all evening. She was 29, with tired eyes, a careful posture, and the kind of calm that came from surviving too many days no one noticed. She had been working the dinner service at Bellamore's, one of Manhattan's most exclusive rooms, for nearly 4 years, long enough to know the sound of expensive laughter, long enough to know when a table's silence meant danger. Tonight, the room belonged to Damian Voss, a man people in the city spoke about in lowered voices, a man whose name opened doors before his face ever entered them. He sat at the center table with the ease of someone born to command attention, a tailored dark suit, a watch that caught the light only when he moved, and eyes that missed very little. Beside him sat his fiancée, her family, and a circle of carefully dressed guests who had been smiling too hard for the last hour. Elena had learned to keep her gaze lowered around people like that. It was safer that way. It was easier that way. But then she saw it. Not a weapon, not a fight, just a small detail, almost nothing, the kind of thing most people would never notice. A server across the room had paused too long near the table. One guest had shifted a glass twice without drinking. Another had brushed a napkin from his lap with fingers that trembled just enough to matter. Elena's heart did not race, it settled. That was the strange thing. Sometimes fear was loud, but certainty was quiet. She looked once more at Damian Voss and saw the faint change in his expression, a man who had also noticed that something in the room no longer felt right. The next course was due in less than a minute, and Elena understood at once that whatever was about to happen had nothing to do with dinner. Her hand tightened around the tray. The room glowed with crystal, candlelight, and soft music from a piano in the corner, yet the air felt suddenly thin, as if every guest had taken the same silent breath and forgotten how to let it go. Damian's fiancée was speaking to him, her smile fixed, her voice light, but he was no longer listening. His attention had moved, sharp and precise, to Elena standing near the service station. Not with suspicion. Not yet. With recognition of something she could not name. Elena lowered her eyes, but she did not move away. There were moments in life when stepping back only made the truth harder to survive. Across the room, one of the guests lifted a hand as if to call for attention, and Elena saw Damian's gaze change again, narrowing just slightly, as though he had finally understood that the evening was balancing on a line no one else had noticed. She had no idea whose world she had just stepped into, or why the instinct in her chest told her to stay exactly where she was, but she knew this much: whatever came next would not remain hidden for long. The room did not relax after Elena spoke. If anything, it tightened. The guests returned to their plates in the shallow, nervous way people do when they are afraid to look curious, yet every face in the private dining room kept drifting back toward her as if pulled by a wire. Damian stood near the head of the table, one hand resting lightly on the back of his chair, his expression unreadable beneath the chandelier light. He had not said a word since recognizing her, but Elena felt the weight of his attention all the same, steady and unsettling, like a hand placed gently over a pulse. At the far end, his fiancée, Victoria, was still smiling, though the smile had thinned at the edges. She said something polite to a seated guest, but her eyes never left Elena for long. It was the kind of stare that tried to shrink a person without ever touching them. Elena knew that look. She had spent too many years learning how to stand inside other people's discomfort without giving them the satisfaction of seeing her break. So she kept her shoulders level, her tray close, and her breathing quiet, even as the room seemed to tilt around her. "You can take the service cart back," Victoria said at last, her tone smooth enough for company and sharp enough for only Elena to hear. "We are done with the appetizers." Elena inclined her head. "Yes, ma'am." She turned toward the hallway, but before she could move more than 2 steps, Damian's voice stopped her. "Stay." It was not loud. It did not need to be. Every conversation in the room fell apart at once. Elena turned back slowly, her heart giving one hard, careful beat. Damian's gaze moved from her face to the tray in her hands and back again, as if he were seeing not a waitress, but a detail in a larger pattern he had only now begun to understand. "Bring the guest list," he said to no one in particular. One of the staff members at the service station blinked in confusion and hurried to obey. Victoria laughed once, lightly, as though the request had been made for fashion and not consequence. "Damian, we are at dinner," she said. "If there is some issue, it can wait until later." But he did not look at her. That was the first crack. Elena noticed it, and so did everyone else. He had not taken his attention away from her to spare anyone's feelings. "No," Damian said, his voice calm in the way deep water is calm. "It cannot wait." The room went still again. A glass touched a saucer somewhere and made the smallest bright sound. Elena's fingers tightened on the tray. She did not understand what guest list he wanted, or why the air in the room now felt arranged around a question she had not yet heard. But then Damian took one step toward her, and the movement carried more intention than any raised voice could have done. "Tell me your full name," he said. Victoria's smile vanished. "Damian," she warned softly. He ignored her. Elena swallowed. "Elena Carter." Something changed in his face. Not enough for the guests to name it, but enough for her to feel it. A memory. A door opening somewhere behind his eyes. His stare dropped for a second to the plain silver ring she wore on a chain beneath her collar, then lifted again with a kind of careful disbelief. "Carter," he repeated, almost to himself. The room held its breath. Elena did not like the way her name sounded in his mouth, as if he had heard it before in a place that no longer existed. A waiter crossed the room too quickly and nearly bumped into the edge of a chair, then froze in embarrassment. No one spoke. Damian finally reached out and took the guest list from the staff member with 2 fingers. He scanned it once, then again, slower this time. His jaw set. "You were not invited," Victoria said, "a little too fast now." "She is part of the service team," one of the hosts added, trying to sound helpful. But Damian kept reading, and Elena saw the exact moment he found what he was looking for. His eyes lifted from the page and settled on her with a new, colder clarity, not unkind, but sharper, as if the evening had just become personal in a way no one had expected. "That is strange," he said quietly. "Because this event was scheduled under a different name." Elena felt the blood leave her face. She had not come here by accident. The realization arrived in pieces, each one small and unbearable. The invitation. The address. The urgent text that had told her to come early and ask for the private room. Not work. Not a tip. A setup. Victoria's expression hardened almost instantly. "You are making this more dramatic than it needs to be." Damian slowly folded the paper once and set it on the table. "Am I?" he asked. The question was mild, but it landed like a verdict. Elena could feel every eye in the room now, some curious, some annoyed, some suddenly afraid of being noticed. She had the strange sensation of standing at the edge of something much larger than herself, something hidden beneath the polished surface of the evening. Damian looked at her again, and this time there was no mistaking it. He was not simply curious. He was assessing. Protecting. Possibly remembering. "Elena," he said, softer now, "who asked you to come here tonight?" And in the silence that followed, Elena realized that answering him might change everything. Elena did not answer right away. The silence around her deepened, but it was no longer empty. It felt watchful, like the entire room had leaned in without moving a muscle. She kept her hands folded in front of her, one thumb pressing against the edge of the other, trying to steady the tremor she could feel gathering beneath her skin. Damian's voice had changed everything. Not because he had said much, but because he had said her name as if it mattered. That alone was enough to make the air feel thinner. Victoria let out a soft, sharp laugh that did not reach her eyes. "This is ridiculous," she said, setting her fork down with deliberate care. "You are all acting as if there is some hidden conspiracy over a dinner invitation." But Elena was not looking at her anymore. Her attention had fallen to the paper in Damian's hand, to the folds and creases now visible under the chandelier glow. Something about it tugged at her memory, not because she had seen the note before, but because she had seen the fear that came with it. The note she had received was short. Too short. "Come early. Ask for the private room. Do not mention my name." She had thought it was a strange request from a man she barely knew, but now, sitting under crystal light, she understood the shape of it. Someone had wanted her inside this room at exactly the wrong time. Or exactly the right one. Damian's gaze did not leave her face. He was not the kind of man who needed to raise his voice to control a room. He simply stood there, calm and unmoving, while everyone else seemed to lose a little of their certainty around him. "Who sent the message?" he asked again, his tone even. Elena swallowed. The answer was still sitting in her throat, heavy and dangerous. Across the table, Victoria's posture stiffened. Her smile, if it could still be called one, had thinned to a line. "Damian," she said carefully, "there is no need for this. Elena is confused, that is all. She has already admitted she is nervous." "I am not confused," Elena said before she could stop herself. The words came out softly, but they landed cleanly. Several people shifted in their seats. Damian's eyes lifted to hers with quiet approval, as if he had expected nothing less. Elena felt a strange pulse of courage rise in her chest, fragile but real. "I received the message from an unknown number," she continued. "It told me to arrive before the others. It said the room would already be arranged." Her voice faltered, but she forced herself on. "It sounded like someone wanted me to see something before anyone else did." At that, the room changed. Not visibly, not all at once, but in the way people breathe when they realize a door they thought was locked has been opened from the inside. One of the men near the far end of the table lowered his glass without drinking. Another stared fixedly at the silverware in front of him. Victoria's expression did not crack, but her eyes sharpened. Damian finally placed the folded paper on the table and looked from Elena to the others, as though measuring every reaction against a truth he had already begun to suspect. "And what exactly was in the room when you arrived?" he asked. Elena hesitated, then reached into the inside pocket of her jacket. The movement drew immediate attention. When she withdrew the small envelope she had not mentioned before, there was a faint ripple of surprise around the table. She set it down between them with careful fingers. "This was on the seat closest to the window," she said. "I did not open it." Damian did not touch the envelope yet. He only stared at it, his jaw tightening just slightly. "Why not?" he asked. Elena met his eyes. "Because I have learned that if something is meant to be hidden, it usually does not want to be found by the right person." For the first time since she had entered the private room, something close to real surprise moved across Damian's face. Not amusement. Not suspicion. Respect. And that quiet shift did not go unnoticed. Victoria noticed it immediately, of course. Her hand tightened around the stem of her glass, and for a single, dangerous second, the polished confidence she wore like jewelry slipped enough to reveal annoyance underneath. "You speak as if you know more than you should," she said. Elena kept her voice calm. "No. I speak as if I know when someone has been set up. The words settled over the table like dust over velvet. No one moved. No one spoke. Damian leaned back slowly, his eyes never leaving Elena's face, and in that measured stillness there was the unmistakable feeling that the room had crossed an invisible line. He was no longer simply questioning her. He was beginning to believe her. And once that happened, Elena sensed, the rest of the truth would not stay buried much longer. Elena felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, but she did not look away from Damian. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was alive, filled with questions no one had dared to speak aloud. Victoria sat perfectly still across the table, her smile strained so tightly it looked painted on. The guests around her kept their heads lowered over untouched plates, pretending to eat while listening to every word. Damian did not move. He simply watched Elena as if the answer she gave next might reveal more than her words ever could. Then, at last, he spoke. "Start from the beginning," he said. His voice was calm, but there was a quiet command in it that made the room feel smaller. Elena drew in a slow breath. This was the moment she had feared since she first stepped into this house, the moment when truth stopped being a private burden and became something everyone in the room would have to carry with her. "My mother used to work for the Alvaros family," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "She cleaned their houses, cooked their meals, and kept their secrets for more years than anyone ever thanked her for." A few heads lifted at that, but Elena kept going. "When she got sick, no one from that household came to help. No one called. No one even asked if she was still alive." Victoria's fingers tightened around her glass. Damian's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "After she died," Elena continued, "I found an old envelope in her things. It had my name on it. Inside was a letter and a list of numbers. She had been saving money in silence for years. Money, she said, belonged to me if anything ever happened to her." The room had gone so still that even the hum of the chandelier seemed to fade. Elena looked down once, then lifted her chin again. The letter also said there were documents. Records. Proof that some of the money moved through accounts tied to this family. "Not because she stole anything," she added quickly, seeing the instant shift in a few faces, "but because she was afraid of what would happen if she spoke while she was still alive." Damian's gaze moved once, briefly, toward Victoria, and returned. "And you came here tonight because of that letter?" It was not a question. Elena nodded. "I came because my mother spent her last years trying to protect me from something she never fully explained. She only said that if anyone from this family ever invited me to a private dinner, I should not come alone and I should not trust the first version of the truth." A thin breath passed through the table. One of the men near the far end set his fork down with a faint metallic click. Victoria laughed softly, but there was no warmth in it. "That is a very dramatic story," she said. "It would be, if it were not true," Elena replied. Damian's eyes stayed on her. He did not defend Victoria. He did not interrupt. He simply waited, and that patience was more dangerous than anger. Elena reached into her purse and took out a folded paper, careful and slow, as though any sudden motion might break the fragile thread holding the room together. "This is a copy of the letter," she said, placing it on the table but not pushing it forward. "I brought it because I knew someone would try to call me unstable, or greedy, or confused. I brought it because my mother taught me that when powerful people rewrite the story, the smallest proof can become a life raft." No one reached for the paper. No one even breathed too loudly. Damian looked at the document for only a second before lifting his eyes to Elena again, and in that look there was something she had not expected to find. Not pity. Not doubt. Recognition. As if he was beginning to understand exactly how long she had been carrying this alone. "Who else knows about this?" he asked quietly. Elena swallowed. No one. Until tonight. The answer seemed to land hard somewhere deeper than the table. Victoria's face tightened, and for the first time her composure slipped just enough for anger to show. Damian leaned back slightly, his hands still composed, his voice still low. Then tonight, he said, we stop pretending this is only a family dinner. The words moved through the room like a change in temperature. The guests sat straighter. The air turned heavy with the knowledge that whatever came next would not be polite, and it would not be ignored. Elena felt her pulse quicken, but she did not regret speaking. Across from her, Damian was no longer simply listening. He was deciding. And by the way Victoria's eyes hardened in response, Elena could tell that she had just crossed into a world where every secret had a cost. Before anyone at the table could find the courage to speak, Elena felt the weight of Damian's attention settle on her like a spotlight in a dark room. He was still, but it was not the stillness of indifference. It was the stillness of a man hearing something he had not expected to hear and refusing to dismiss it too quickly. Victoria kept her hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully arranged, but Elena noticed the faint tension in her jaw, the smallest crack in the polished control she had shown all evening. Damian did not look at Victoria. He kept his eyes on Elena. Start from the beginning, he said, his voice even, almost gentle, though there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. Elena drew in a slow breath. The air in the room felt heavy now, thick with expensive perfume, polished silver, and the silence of people who suddenly understood they were no longer watching a pleasant dinner. They were watching something break open. It began 3 weeks ago, Elena said. I did not come here to cause trouble. I came because I was asked to keep quiet, and I did it because I thought silence would protect people. No one reached for their glass. No one touched their food. Even the servers seemed to have paused at the edge of the room, as if the walls themselves were listening. Damian's gaze did not leave her face. Who asked you? He said. Elena's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, but she did not raise it. Someone who knew I would be easy to dismiss, she replied. Someone who believed that if I was quiet enough, careful enough, and grateful enough, I would never be believed. That landed harder than any raised voice could have. Victoria looked up sharply, her smile gone now, replaced by a brittle, cold stillness. One of the guests cleared his throat and immediately regretted it when Damian turned his head a fraction in his direction. The message was clear without a single harsh word. This was not a room for interruptions. This was a room for truth. Damian leaned forward slightly, resting one hand near the edge of the table. His cufflink caught the light as he moved. And you decided tonight was the night to stop being quiet. Elena met his eyes. Tonight was the first time I knew someone in this room might actually listen. The sentence hung there. It was not an accusation, but it carried one anyway. Damian's expression changed in a way that was small enough to miss if someone was not watching closely, but Elena was watching closely now. Something in him had shifted from formal concern to personal focus. He was not simply hearing her. He was weighing every word against everything he had already suspected. Across the table, Victoria finally spoke, her voice smooth but too controlled to be innocent. Elena, if you are implying that I had anything to do with this, she began, but Damian raised a hand, and she stopped at once. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. No one is implying anything, he said. She is speaking. You will let her finish. The room tightened further. Elena felt her pulse in her throat, but for the first time that night, she did not feel alone. Not because the room had grown kind, but because the balance of power had started to shift, and everyone at the table could feel it. There are documents, Elena said quietly. I did not bring them here to accuse anyone without proof. I brought them because I was told the truth would matter if I was brave enough to place it in the right hands. Damian's eyes lowered for a brief moment, as if he were considering a map only he could see. Then he looked back at her. "And whose hands are those?" Elena did not answer at once. The question felt larger than the room. It felt like a door opening. Victoria's breathing had become shallow. The guests were no longer pretending not to listen. Even the chandelier above them seemed to glow more dimly, as if the house itself had realized the evening had changed course. Elena lifted her chin. "Yours." The single word moved through the room like a quiet shock. Damian did not react loudly. That was what made his reaction so unsettling. He simply stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable, his posture composed, while everyone else waited for a command, a denial, or a dismissal. Instead, he said, "Then the dinner is over." No one spoke. No one moved. Elena looked at him, uncertain whether she had just won a battle or stepped deeper into one. Damian's eyes stayed on hers as he stood, and when he did, the whole table seemed to rise with him in spirit if not in body. "Bring the documents to my study," he said. "And Elena," he added, his voice lowering just enough to make the words feel private despite the audience, "if what you are carrying is real, then tonight no one gets to bury it again." The room went absolutely still. And for the first time, Elena understood that the most dangerous thing in the house was no longer the secret itself. It was the man who had just decided to hear it. Elena stood very still as the room waited for Damian to make his next move. No one touched their glass. No one reached for the food that had gone cold under the warm glow of the dining room lights. The chandelier above them cast a polished gold across the table, but it could not soften the tension that had settled over every shoulder in the room. Damian remained at the head of the table, his expression calm in a way that felt more dangerous than anger. His attention never left Elena. It was the kind of attention that made people straighten their backs without realizing it. Victoria had gone quiet, but Elena could feel the sharpness of her silence like a blade kept just out of sight. "Bring them to my study," Damian had said, and that one sentence had changed the shape of the entire night. Elena knew she should have felt relief. Instead, her pulse kept moving faster. Because now the secret was no longer hidden in her hands. It had been placed in the center of the house, where everyone could see it, and where no one could pretend not to care. A few seconds passed. Then Damian pushed back his chair with a controlled scrape that sounded far louder than it should have. Several guests flinched. He did not look at them. He stood, tall and unhurried, and Elena noticed how effortlessly the room seemed to organize itself around his movement. Even the staff near the doorway stopped in place, waiting for permission to breathe again. "Elena," he said, not harshly, but with a steadiness that made his voice impossible to ignore, "come with me." The words were not a command in the usual sense. They were an opening. An invitation. A test. Elena rose slowly, smoothing her hands over the front of her dress because she needed something ordinary to do with them. Her fingertips were cold. She could feel the heat of everyone's gaze on her back as she crossed the room, one careful step at a time, toward the study door that had suddenly become more important than the entire dinner. Damian did not rush her. He waited until she reached him, then walked beside her with the same measured pace he used for every decision that mattered. The study was dimmer than the dining room, lined with dark wood and shelves that held books Elena suspected no one in the house ever had time to read. A desk lamp glowed over a polished surface, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. Damian shut the door behind them, and the quiet that followed felt deep enough to hear a heartbeat. Elena set the documents down with care. The folder made a soft sound against the wood. Damian did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he looked at her as if the paper mattered less than the hands that had carried it. "Start from the beginning," he said. Elena swallowed once. The room seemed smaller now, stripped of the audience, but somehow more difficult in its silence. My mother kept records, she said. Not because she trusted the people around her, but because she learned early that the truth survives only when someone protects it. Damian said nothing. He simply listened, his face unreadable, his posture still. That silence gave her permission to continue. She told him about the boxes hidden in a closet, about the names that had been repeated too often in whispers, about the dates written in careful ink by a woman who had spent her life trying to stay unnoticed. She did not dramatize any of it. She did not need to. The facts were enough. By the time she reached the end, the only sound in the study was the faint hum of the lamp and the steadier rhythm of Damian turning the pages. At last, he stopped. His eyes remained on the document for a long moment before he looked up at her. There was no impatience in his face now, and no disbelief. Only concentration. These records, he said quietly, were never meant to survive. Elena held his gaze. And yet they did. Something shifted then. Not visibly. Not in a way anyone would have noticed from outside the room. But Elena saw it in the slight narrowing of his eyes, in the way his hand rested now against the edge of the desk as if he had moved from observation into decision. He was no longer treating her like a guest making an uncomfortable claim. He was treating her like someone who had brought him a truth he could not afford to ignore. Damian turned one page back and studied a line near the bottom. Elena waited, breathing shallowly. Then, without looking away from the paper, he said, "Your mother knew what she was leaving behind." "Yes," Elena replied, her voice low. "And she knew someone would eventually try to make sure no one else ever saw it." At that, Damian's jaw tightened just slightly. It was not a display. It was restraint. The kind of restraint that suggested a man forcing himself to think before he acted. He closed the folder and placed both hands flat on the desk, as if grounding himself. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed. It was still calm, but the calm had edges now. "Then we do this properly," he said. Elena looked at him, unsure what he meant. Damian met her eyes. No more half-truths. No more whispers. "If these documents are real, then we verify every name, every date, every signature. And if someone has spent years hiding what belongs in the open, they will answer for it." Elena felt the room tilt, not with fear, but with the startling weight of being believed. For so long, she had carried the burden alone, fearing that speaking up would only make her smaller. Instead, here in the low light of his study, Damian had done the one thing she had not dared hope for. He had taken her seriously. Not gently. Not out of pity. Out of respect. And that, more than anything, made her chest ache. Damian picked up the folder again, then paused and looked at her with a strange seriousness that almost resembled caution. "You said your mother protected these papers for years," he said. "That means she was either very brave or very afraid." Elena answered before she could stop herself. She was both. For the first time that night, something like understanding moved across his face. Not softness exactly. But recognition. He glanced once toward the closed door, toward the silent dining room beyond it, and then back to Elena. "Then she was smarter than most of the people in this house," he said. Elena almost smiled. Almost. But the moment passed before it could become anything more. Damian reached for the phone on his desk and made one short call, his tone clipped and controlled, asking for records, backups, and names from an office Elena had never seen. When he ended the call, he stood in silence for a beat, one hand resting on the desk, the other still holding the folder like evidence that had just come alive. "You did the right thing coming here," he said at last. Elena looked down at the papers, then back at him. "I was not sure anyone would care." Damian's answer came without hesitation. "I care what is true." The words settled between them with the force of a door locking into place. Outside the study, the house remained silent, but inside, something permanent had begun. And Elena understood, with a clarity that made her breath catch, that the night had moved past the point of turning back. Whatever was hidden in those pages had finally found a witness. And Damian was no longer merely listening. He was preparing to act. Elena remained in the study as the last of the house staff disappeared down the corridor, and the quiet that followed felt almost ceremonial. Damian did not sit again. He stood beside his desk with the folder open in front of him, reading the pages with the same steady focus he brought to every decision that mattered. The lamp beside him cast a warm circle of light over the documents, but it could not hide the hardness in his expression as he moved from page to page. Elena watched him in silence, her hands folded tightly together, careful not to interrupt what had already become something larger than a conversation. He was no longer reacting. He was measuring. He was connecting names, dates, signatures, and gaps in the record with a patience that made his attention feel even more formidable. When he finally looked up, the room seemed to tighten around that single motion. "This was not carelessness," he said quietly. Elena lifted her chin. "No," she answered, her voice soft but certain. "It was deliberate." Damian's gaze stayed on her for a long beat, and in that stillness she saw the change working through him. Not anger. Not suspicion. Recognition. The kind that comes when a man understands he has been standing near a hidden truth without realizing how close he already was. He set one page down and folded his arms, his tone still controlled, though now it carried something sharper beneath it. "Then someone wanted this to disappear." Elena nodded once. "Yes." The word left her almost in a whisper, but it held the weight of every hour she had spent afraid to say it aloud. Damian turned slightly toward the window, the dark glass reflecting the room behind him in ghostly layers of gold and shadow. For a moment he said nothing, and Elena could sense the machinery of his mind moving behind his calm face. He was not the kind of man who rushed to conclusion. He wanted structure, proof, and a clear line between what could be explained and what could not. Yet even with that discipline, the pieces were starting to form a picture he clearly did not like. He reached for the second set of papers Elena had brought and separated them from the first with careful precision. "You said these records were missing from the archive," he said. "They were," Elena replied. "I found copies in a storage cabinet no one had opened in years. If I had not looked there, they would have stayed buried." Damian's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed low. "Who gave you the access?" Elena hesitated only a fraction. "No one. I took the risk because I knew I would not be believed otherwise." That answer seemed to land harder than any dramatic confession could have. Damian looked at her then, not as a woman who had brought him trouble, but as someone who had already paid a private price to bring him the truth. Something in his expression shifted again, subtle but unmistakable. Respect, perhaps. Or the beginning of it. "You were right," he said at last. "That is enough for me to continue." Elena let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. In the hallway outside, the house remained silent, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt watchful, waiting for a decision that would alter the shape of the night. Damian moved around the desk and placed the folder on its center with deliberate care, as if sealing away one chapter so he could open the next. "Victoria will not like this," he said. Elena's eyes lowered for a brief moment, then returned to his. "She already knows more than she admits." Damian studied her face, then gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible. "And you are prepared to stand by what you have said?" "I would not have come if I was not." He held that answer for a moment before reaching for the intercom on his desk. When he spoke, his voice was even, measured, and impossible to ignore. He asked for the private records office, the original storage logs, and the names of everyone who had handled the files in the last 6 months. The request was calm, but it changed the air in the room. Elena could feel it instantly. Nothing about the night would return to what it had been before. Damian ended the call and rested one hand on the desk, looking down at the papers again as if they had become more dangerous now that they were no longer hidden. "If this reaches the wrong hands," he said, almost to himself, "it will not stay a secret for long." Elena met his eyes. "Then it should not stay hidden." For the first time, a faint, unreadable expression crossed his face, something between approval and concern. "No," he said. "It should not." The word seemed to settle in the room like a final lock clicking into place. Elena felt the shift in that moment more clearly than before. She had entered the house carrying a burden she believed might destroy her, but now the burden had become evidence, and evidence had become responsibility. Damian was no longer simply listening from a distance. He was standing inside the truth with her, and that made him far more dangerous to the people who had tried to bury it. Yet it also made him, in some quiet and undeniable way, the only person in the house who could still choose what happened next. He looked once more at the papers, then at Elena, and his voice softened by a fraction. "Stay here until I know more." It was not a request. It was protection. Elena gave a small nod, and for the first time since she had entered the room, her fear loosened enough to let hope breathe beneath it. Outside, the corridor remained still, but somewhere beyond the study walls, the house was beginning to feel the weight of what had just changed. And Elena understood with sudden clarity that the night was no longer about whether the truth existed. It was about how long it would take before everyone else was forced to face it. Elena stayed where Damian had told her to stay, but her stillness was no longer the stillness of fear. It was the stillness of someone standing at the edge of a door that had finally begun to open. The study felt different now. Not lighter, exactly, but clearer, as if the air itself had been pulled taut by the force of what had just been uncovered. Damian had gone from page to page with a calm that was almost unsettling, his attention fixed, his jaw set, his silence sharper than any accusation. Elena watched him from the chair near the desk, her hands folded tightly in her lap, listening to the low sound of paper turning and the faint hum of the lamp beside him. Every few moments, he would pause, reread a line, and his expression would change by only the smallest degree, yet that was enough. Enough to tell her he was seeing the shape of the truth now, not just its outlines. Enough to tell her that the burden she had carried alone for so long had finally reached a mind strong enough to hold it. Outside the study, the house remained unnaturally quiet, the kind of quiet that belonged to places where people pretended not to hear what they already feared. Somewhere down the corridor, a door closed softly. Somewhere farther away, a voice murmured and then stopped. Elena did not move. She could feel that the house had begun to notice itself, to sense that something had shifted inside its walls. Damian set one page on top of another, then reached for the last section of the folder. The final pages were thinner, more worn, as if they had been handled too many times by people who thought they could keep them hidden forever. He read those lines more slowly, and when he reached the bottom, he remained there, looking at the paper without speaking. The lamp threw a warm glow across his hands, but it could not soften the hard tension in his shoulders. Elena saw him close his eyes for a brief moment, not in weakness, but in restraint. When he opened them again, they were steady. Focused. Changed. He finally spoke, though his voice was lower than before. This was not a misunderstanding. The words landed in the room with quiet force. Elena lifted her gaze to him, and for a second she did not trust herself to answer. Damian did not wait. He placed the last page back into the folder with deliberate care, then straightened, as though the simple act of standing had become a decision. Someone expected this to stay buried, he said. Someone expected fear to do the rest. Elena swallowed, her throat tight with everything she had never been allowed to say aloud. They counted on no one asking questions, she replied. Damian looked at her then, and the faintest shift passed through his expression, not surprise, but confirmation. She had not only told him the truth. She had given shape to what he already suspected. He moved around the desk, stopping only when he stood near enough for her to see the severity in his face and the control he used to keep it there. "Who else knows?" he asked. Elena hesitated, and in that hesitation the entire room seemed to hold its breath with her. "Not enough people," she said at last. "Or maybe the wrong people knew too much." A long silence followed. Damian absorbed that answer without interruption, his eyes steady on hers, measuring not just the words but the cost of them. Then he turned slightly, looking toward the closed study door as if the rest of the house had become a problem he could no longer postpone. "Then we do this properly," he said. His tone was calm, but there was nothing casual in it. No more hiding. No more half-truths. Elena felt something inside her loosen, fragile and almost painful in its release. It was not relief exactly. It was the shock of being taken seriously after a lifetime of being told to wait, be quiet, and trust that someone else would decide what mattered. Damian reached for his phone, but before he could unlock it, there was a soft knock at the door. The sound was careful, almost respectful, yet it changed the temperature in the room at once. Damian looked toward Elena, then toward the door, his face unreadable. "Come in," he said. The door opened slowly. One of the house staff stepped inside, pale and uncertain, holding a small envelope in both hands. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "this was left at the front gate less than 5 minutes ago." Damian did not move immediately. Elena watched the expression in his eyes harden, not with anger, but with recognition. He took the envelope, turned it once in his hand, and saw what was written across the front. No name. No return address. Only a single line, written in careful block letters that seemed to press against the paper from the inside: "You should read this before morning." The room fell silent again, but it was a different silence now. Not the silence of waiting. The silence of impact. Damian lifted his eyes from the envelope and looked toward Elena, and in that one glance she understood that the night had just found another door. One that had been opened for them, not by accident, but by someone who knew exactly how far this truth could reach. Damian held the envelope still, unread, as if sensing that whatever was inside would not simply add to the story. It would change the direction of it. And Elena, watching his face in the dim gold light, knew with a quiet chill that the next decision would belong to no one in the house but him. Damian did not move for several seconds after reading the envelope, and in that stillness Elena could see the exact moment when the room stopped feeling like a house and started feeling like a verdict waiting to be delivered. The paper rested in his hand under the amber study light, untouched, while his eyes narrowed with the kind of focus that made everything around him seem to fade. Elena stood near the doorway exactly where he had told her to remain, her hands folded so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale, but she was no longer trembling the way she had at the beginning of the night. Something had shifted. Not because the danger had disappeared, but because it had finally been named. Damian looked up from the envelope and across the room, toward the window, toward the shelves, toward the quiet corners where secrets liked to hide. Then he opened the envelope with careful fingers and drew out a single sheet of paper. There were no dramatic marks, no flourish, only lines written in a measured hand, as if whoever had sent it understood that restraint could carry more weight than rage. Elena watched his face while he read. First the set of his jaw changed. Then the muscle near his temple tightened. Then, very slowly, something colder than anger passed through his expression: recognition. He did not ask who had written it. He did not need to. Whatever was on that page belonged to a history he had only half allowed himself to remember, a history that had been buried under loyalty, caution, and the false comfort of silence. When he finished, he lowered the paper without speaking, and the room seemed to hold its breath with him. Elena could hear the soft ticking of the clock on the far wall, the faint hum of the old lamp, the sound of her own pulse moving too loudly in her ears. Damian folded the page once, then again, and placed it beside the open envelope as though he were setting down a weapon no one else in the house yet understood. "This goes deeper than I thought," he said at last, his voice low and measured, carrying none of the uncertainty that Elena had heard earlier in the night. It was the voice of a man who had just crossed from suspicion into certainty. Elena did not answer right away. She had learned enough about him by then to understand that he did not want comfort, and he did not want panic. He wanted truth, complete and unpolished. So she gave him that. "I did not want to believe it either," she said softly. "But I knew the way it looked. I knew what people were trying to hide." Damian's gaze returned to her, and for a moment the severity in his face softened into something more complicated. "Not kindness exactly, but respect. The kind that is not spoken easily and not given lightly." "You should have told me sooner," he said, though there was no accusation in it. Elena looked down once, then back up. "I was afraid no one would listen." That was when the silence changed again. Damian leaned back slightly, one hand still resting on the edge of the desk, and the air around him seemed to settle into a harder shape. "That ends tonight," he said. Not loudly. Not for effect. Simply as a decision. He reached for the phone on the desk, paused, and looked at the envelope one more time before making the call. Elena watched him speak in a calm, controlled voice to someone on the other end, giving instructions that were brief, precise, and impossible to ignore. She could not hear every word, but she understood enough to know that the night was no longer drifting toward discovery. It was moving toward exposure. When he ended the call, he stood very still, staring at the paper as if it had become heavier in the span of a few minutes. Then he turned to Elena again. "You are going to stay here," he said. "Locked doors, lights on, and if anyone tries to come up to this room, you call me immediately." Elena nodded once. She had expected fear to return at that command, but instead she felt something steadier. The strange, quiet relief of being believed. Damian crossed the study and, for the first time that night, stopped close enough that Elena could see the fatigue in his face beneath the control. "Whatever happens next," he said, "you are not standing alone in it." His words did something unexpected. They did not erase the danger, but they changed its shape. They made it bearable. Outside the study, the house remained silent, but silence no longer meant safety. It meant waiting. Damian took the envelope, tucked it beneath his arm, and headed for the door with a purpose that made even the corridor beyond seem to straighten. Before leaving, he looked back once at Elena, and in that glance there was no hesitation left. Only resolve. The night had reached its turning point, and the truth was no longer a private burden carried by one frightened woman in a dim room. It had become a matter of time, and Damian had chosen which side of it he would stand on. By the time the door closed behind him, Elena understood that the house would not remain the same by morning. Somewhere beyond the walls, arrangements were already shifting. Somewhere behind careful faces and polished doors, the people who had counted on silence were about to learn what happens when a hidden story finally finds the right person to read it. And in the quiet that followed, Elena stood alone in the study, listening to the clock, knowing that the hardest part was no longer whether the truth would come out. It was how many lives it would change when it did.